Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome. My name is Nick Brand. I'm the Director of Corporate Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and thank you all for joining us this evening. It's with great pleasure that we welcome Mr. Bill Browder back to Chicago and his first time at the Chicago Council. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. I'd also like to thank Munir Sadr for helping to coordinate this evening's program, so thank you so much for your assistance in coordinating. After the program, Mr. Browder's recent book, Red Notice, A True Story of High Finance, Murder, and One Man's Fight for Justice, will be available for purchase and signing just outside the room. We are on the record this evening, so that means you are welcome to use social media and tweet, but please do silence your phones. We're also live streaming, so the video from this evening will be available on our website tomorrow, along with the audio from the program. This program is part of a series the Council has hosted this spring focusing on Russia and Ukraine. Upcoming on April 21st, we'll be hosting Professor Angela Stent. She's the Director for the Center for Eurasian and East European Studies at Georgetown University. She'll be discussing Putin's Russia, riddle or realpolitik. Upcoming corporate program that should be exciting on May 5th, we'll be hosting a program on Inside the International Boardroom, and that'll feature directors from Abbott, Alcoa, Boeing, Cargill, McDonald's, Motorola Solutions, and more. So it should be a great event. Check it out. I'd like to thank our members this evening for their support. Our programs are membership supported, so thank you so much for helping to make this evening possible. For those of you that are interested in becoming members, we're running a promotion this evening, or if you become a member tonight, you get a copy of the book for free. So please do talk to staff if you're interested. So I will return to moderate the Q&A this evening, but right now, to introduce Mr. Browder, please join me in welcoming the chairman of Sadr Investment Management and a good friend of the Chicago Council, Munir Sadr.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm delighted to introduce you to Bill Browder, who has been a good friend of mine for 22 years. He is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. He was the largest foreign investor in Russia until November 2005, when he was suddenly denied entry to the country and declared, quote, a threat to national security, unquote, by the Russian government for his role in exposing corruption at large Russian companies. Bill's lawyer, Sergey Magnitsky, uncovered a $230 million fraud committed by Russian government officials. Sergey was arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and killed in 2009 in a Russian prison by Russian government officials. Since then, Bill has been leading a global campaign to expose the corruption and human rights abuses endemic in Russia. As a result of Bill's campaign, the Sergey Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act was signed into U.S. law in 2012, imposing visa bans and asset freezes on certain officials involved in Magnitsky's death and on other gross violators of human rights in Russia. Bill is currently working to have similar legislation passed across the European Union as a means to seek justice for Magnitsky, but also to fight government-backed corruption in Russia. He's also working on a global Magnitsky bill in the U.S., which is currently making its way through Congress. Bill has been doing all of this at great personal risk. Now, Bill's grandfather, Errol Browder, was the founder of the U.S. Communist Party. However, Bill became a capitalist. Before founding Hermitage, Bill Browder was vice president of Salomon Brothers. He holds a BA Honors in Economics from the University of Chicago and an MBA from Stanford Business School. Now, I once told Bill that his grandfather must be turning over in his grave with Bill as a capitalist. It's the only time that I can remember Bill getting angry at me, and he said, Munir, my grandfather was fighting for the little guy, and I'm fighting for the little guy in Russia, and my grandfather would be proud of me. And I think that's right, Bill. At any rate, Bill has recently published a book, a New York Times bestseller entitled Red Notice, A True Story of High Finance, Murder, and One Man's Fight for International Justice, which recounts his experiences in Russia, his ongoing fight for justice for Sergey, and for the Russian people. By the way, Bill is a Chicago native who grew up here in our great city. So Bill, we're very proud of you and your courageous battle for human rights in Russia, and we're delighted to welcome you home.
Good evening. It's nice to be back in Chicago. I left here about 25 years ago, and it feels like a homecoming to be here. Now, whenever somebody does an introduction like Munir just did, people have this, and then I start to talk. People hear my accent, my American accent, maybe my Chicago accent, and they wonder how it is that this guy from Chicago ended up in such a mess in Russia. And so I'd like to tell you the story. Now, as Munir mentioned, I come from an unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, was from Wichita, Kansas. And he was a labor union organizer from Wichita. And he was so good at organizing the labor union that at some point the communists spotted him. And they said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Russia? So Earl, in 1927, went to Moscow. And he did what many young American men do when they get to Moscow, which was he met a Russian girl who became my grandmother. My father was born in Moscow, along with one of my uncles. And then in 1932, 5 years after they arrived, my grandfather took the family back to America, where he became the general secretary of the American Communist Party for the next 13 years. He ran for president against Roosevelt in 1936 on the communist ticket, ran again in 1940, was imprisoned by Roosevelt in 1941 for being a communist, and then pardoned in 42, then expelled from the Communist Party by Stalin in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist, and then persecuted by Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s for being a communist. So this was my family legacy. I was born in 1964, and I moved with my family to Chicago at the age of 1, and grew up in the Hyde Park University community. My father was a professor. And when I got to my teenage years, I went through what normally happens with a teenager, which was I decided to go through a family rebellion. But how do you rebel from a family of communists and left-wing academics? I looked at all of the options available to me, growing my hair long, following rock bands, etc. None of those were particularly shocking to my family. But then I searched my soul and figured out what was really shocked them, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. There was nothing that would upset my family more than that. So I became a capitalist, and I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated business school in 1989. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my career, I had this actually 1989 was a very significant year because that was the year the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my career, I had this epiphany, which was if my grandfather was the largest communist in America, and I was trying to find my career, I was going to go become the biggest, or try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what I set out to do. So I moved to London in 1989, which was as close as I could get to Eastern Europe. And I got a job with the Boston Consulting Group, which was a big American consulting company. And I said, I want to be your Eastern European guy. And they said, well, we have nothing going on in Eastern Europe, but at the moment we do, you can be our guy. And so one day they came to me about 6 months later and said, we've got something in Eastern Europe. There's a bus factory, a failing bus factory in the corner of Poland on the Ukrainian border, and we need send somebody out there for 6 months to help them stop failing. Why don't you go out there? So I took the assignment to try to fix this failing bus factory, which was pretty much unfixable. But while I was there, several months into my assignment, I noticed something very interesting, which was that my translator, who accompanied me everywhere, had a newspaper with him all the time. And on one particular day, I noticed that there were all these financial figures in the newspaper. And I asked him, what are these financial figures? And he said, oh, these are the very first Polish privatizations. And I said, that's interesting. And so I sat down at the table at the conference room, and I started to have him translate for me. And I said, what is this number? He said, this is the number of shares outstanding And what is this number? This is the price per share that they want to sell the shares in the privatizations. And I did the math, and it was $80 million. So that was the market value of the company. And I said, what's this number down below? And he said, that's the last year's profits. I said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, that's what it says, the last year's profits. And so that number was $160 million. So you don't have to be a Stanford MBA to know that if you can buy a company for $80 million that has $160 million of profits, that's a pretty good deal. And I thought to myself, well, I can't fix this bus company, but it's quite interesting what's going on with these privatizations. And I just kept on going over and over in my mind. And I thought, I really, isn't this what people go to business school for, is to do this type of stuff? And I thought, yeah, this is. And so I didn't have any money. I wasn't wealthy or anything, but I had about $2,000 of life savings. And so I took my $2,000 of life savings, I converted it into Polish zloty. I went with my translator to the post office, and I subscribed for the very first privatizations in Eastern Europe. And afterwards, the shares that I bought went up 10 times. Now, I don't know how many of you in the audience have had shares that have gone up 10 times before. But let me tell you something. If you have, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It releases a certain chemical in your stomach. And it's very addictive. And you want to repeat that exercise over and over again. And so at that moment in time, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life, which was to have many more of these 10 baggers. I wanted to be an investor. And so we fast forward a few years, and I end up at Salomon Brothers, the big American investment bank, which was written about in Liar's Poker, a famous book that I'm sure many of you have read. And I got a job on the East European investment banking team. And my first assignment at Salomon Brothers was to advise a fishing fleet in Murmansk, which is a few hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle, on their privatization. So I go to Murmansk, and it's a very arduous trip to get from London to Murmansk. You have to fly to St. Petersburg and then wait for 12 hours at the airport, and then fly another few hours from St. Petersburg far north. And I get to Murmansk, and the general director of the fishing fleet picks me up at the airport, and he takes me down to the dock area, and he shows me one of their boats. And the Murmansk trawler fleet had these enormous fishing vessels. They were several hundred feet long, and they were not just fishing vessels, but also factory vessels where they would take the fish and can them and so on. And so I asked him, well, how much does one of these boats cost? And he said, we buy them, when they're new, they cost about $20 million. And I said, how many of them do you have? And he said, we have about 100. And I said, okay, so that's $20 million times 100. And I said, well, how old is the fleet? And he said, it's about 7 years old. So I figured maybe they have about $1 billion worth of ships. And I said, and you've hired me to advise you on whether to be involved in this privatization or not. What is the price? And the management, by the way, had the right to buy 51% of this fishing fleet legitimately under the Russian privatization program. And so I said, what is the price that you're being asked to pay? So he said, for 51%, they want us to pay $2.5 million. So $1 billion worth of ships, and they can buy 51% for $2.5 million. And then that chemical in my stomach started to release again. And I thought, I don't know what I'm advising these people on. I should be participating in this. And and there was no opportunity on this particular fishing fleet to participate. But I was supposed to fly back to London after this meeting in Murmansk, but I decided instead to fly to Moscow to find out if this was an anomaly or whether this was going on more broadly. So I go to Moscow, and I didn't speak a word of Russian, and I didn't know anybody in Moscow. So I bought a yellow page, an English language yellow page directory, which they sold at the airport, which is a very thin little document. And I went to the Metropole Hotel. I called up a friend of mine in London and said, can you help me find a driver and translator? And I got the name of two people who I called up, and they They came the next morning, and I started making cold calls to people in the Yellow Page directory to figure out anyone who would meet with me who knew anything about anything related to privatization. And I had a whole bunch of meetings with just anyone who would meet with me over the course of the week. I had about 40 meetings. And by the end of the week, I had figured out that it wasn't just this fishing fleet that they were giving away for free, they were giving everything away for free. And what they did most broadly was something called the voucher privatization program. And the voucher privatization program was one where they gave a physical certificate called a voucher to every person over the age of 18. So they gave away 150 million certificates, vouchers. And these were bearer instruments. They were like a dollar bill. You could use it as a currency, and people were buying and selling them. And the average price of the voucher was $20. And so, again, as you can probably tell, I'm a sort of I'm a calculator type of guy, and so I did the math, and so it's $20 times 150 million vouchers gets you to $3 billion worth of vouchers. And these $3 billion worth of vouchers were exchangeable for 30% of all the share capital of Russian companies, which meant that the entire market value of Russia at this point in time, and this was 1992, was $10 billion. So the entire value of the country, and just to put this in perspective, Russia is a country with 35% of the world's natural gas, 10% of the world's oil, 10% of the world's aluminum, 10% of the world's steel, fertilizer, on and on and on. The entire country was $10 billion. And so this was something just truly remarkable. So I go back to Salomon Brothers to try to get them to switch gears, and instead of doing advisory work, that we should be doing investing work. And basically nobody wanted to hear it. And the more I talked about it, the more people got upset with me. And all the young guys who I was hanging around with for lunch and drinks after work stopped inviting me for lunch and drinks. And I was on the verge of being fired until a partner from the New York office heard about this whole thing and then said, listen, I want to talk to you. And I went to New York, explained to him the valuations. He said, that sounds amazing. We should invest in it. He gave me $25 million of the firm's capital to invest. We invested in it. And about 8 months later, The Economist wrote an article about just going through the same math I've just taken you through. And about 25 rich guys and hedge funds and various other people showed up to invest. And our $25 million portfolio turned into $125 million. And all of a sudden, everybody, all the guys who had stopped hanging around my desk, or stopped inviting me to lunch were hanging around my desk wanting to get stock tips on how to make 5 times their money in Russia. Very quickly after this, I decided that it was better for me to be my own man as opposed to employee, and I left Solomon. I set up an investment fund called Hermitage Capital. I moved to Moscow, and I started investing in Russia for Hermitage Capital. I had one big investor named Edmund Safra, who was the owner of Republic National Bank of New York. He put up the first $25 million, and I moved to Moscow, and I started this fund. And I couldn't have started the fund at a better time. I started in April of 1996, and it was just at the time that Yeltsin was running for re-election. It looked like the communists might win, and the communists didn't win. And in the first 18 months of my fund's operation, the fund went up 800%. So my fund goes up 800%. I go from 25 million to $1 billion of assets under management. I was the best performing fund manager in the world in 1997. My clients were inviting me to their yachts to celebrate my financial brilliance. I was featured on the front page of the business section of the New York Times, et cetera, and I was 33 years old. Now, any of these successes individually would have been something to celebrate, but if you put them all together, in the parlance of Wall Street, it's the biggest sell signal there ever was. But I was 33 years old, and I thought this was going to go on forever, and of course it didn't. And 1998, the Russian government defaulted on their bonds, devalued their currency by 75%, and the value of my $1 billion portfolio went down 90%. I lost $900 million. So as much as making 10 times your money leaves a certain feeling in your stomach. Losing 90% gives you a different feeling in your stomach. And it wasn't just the financial loss that was so upsetting to me. For me, it was what was more upsetting was that I had invited a lot of people to invest in my fund who had trusted me with their money, and I'd lost most of it for them. And I was really deeply humiliated and upset by what I had done. And I wanted to get my clients out of the mess that I'd gotten them into. And so I vowed to myself that I was going to stay and fight it out and get them out of this mess. And it shouldn't have been that hard to do, because when things go down that much, they generally rebound, except for one thing, which is the oligarchs who owned, there were 22 oligarchs who owned the majority shares of most of these Russian companies. And these oligarchs, they had this, before the 1998 collapse, they had been visited by all these investment bankers from Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and so on, who told them that if you behave yourself, you can get free money from Wall Street. And so for a brief period of time, the oligarchs had behaved themselves up until the collapse of '98. But afterwards, nobody on Wall Street wanted to have anything to do with them, whether they behaved themselves or not. And so there was no longer any incentive to behave themselves. And in Russia, there's never been any disincentive to misbehaving. And so in 1998 and 1999, the oligarchs embarked on an orgy of stealing which has been unprecedented in the history of business. And I was sitting there, they were doing transfer pricing, asset stripping, dilutions, embezzlement, you name it, they were doing it. And I was sitting there with my last 10 cents on the dollar, and I was about to have that stolen away from me. And so, as a matter of economic necessity, I decided to start fighting the oligarchs to stop them from stealing. And the most famous fight that I was involved with was in a company called Gazprom. And most people have heard of Gazprom. And Gazprom, there was an enormous amount of stealing going on. And so we decided in 1999 to do a stealing analysis of Gazprom to figure out how much of the stealing really was happening. And I should point out that at the time, the shares were trading at a 99.7% discount per barrel of reserves to Exxon and BP. And because the market thought that everything was being stolen. So we started our stealing analysis, and I should point out that this was not something I learned at Stanford Business School. And the way that I went about my stealing analysis was to set up breakfast, lunches, dinners, teas, and coffees with anybody who knew about stealing at Gazprom who would meet with me. And so we embarked on this sort of series of meals with these people and asked the question. And I didn't know whether they would be cooperative or uncooperative in my in the answer to my question. But it turns out that in the communist era, the richest person in Russia was 6 times richer than the poorest person. If you maybe you're a member of the Politburo, you had a dacha and a car and a bigger apartment. But by 1999, the richest person in Russia was 250,000 times richer than the poorest person. And this all happened in a 10-year period. And had this type of disparity of wealth happening so quickly poisoned the psychology of a whole nation. And so as a result of that, these people in these meetings spilled their guts to me and my colleagues about all the stealing. And we were just busy writing all this stuff down to try to get it all down. It was the most outrageous and unbelievable stories you could imagine. So we wrote it all down. But then the question was, how much of it was true? Could have been sour grapes or exaggeration or whatever. And then we had this unbelievable stroke of luck. My head of research was driving his car in Moscow at Pushkin Square, which is a big snarl up in the traffic of Moscow. And because the traffic is stationary for such a long period of time at this intersection, this market of street urchins has emerged, where they sell things at this intersection. And one day when my head of research was at this intersection, some kid came up to his car and he said, "I'm selling discs." And my head of research said, "What kind of discs?" And he said, "Well, I'm selling the Moscow Registration Chamber database disc." And he said, "How much?" $5. So he bought it and brought it back to the office, stuck it in the computer, and sure enough, that was the Moscow Registration Chamber database, which shows beneficial ownership of all Moscow-based companies. And then there was a phone number on the disc. And we bought some more discs. And with all this information, this all comes from government databases, we were able to confirm all the stuff we had learned from all these meetings. And we were able to confirm with documentary evidence that the management of Gazprom between 1996 and 1999, 9 individuals had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait. Now, as you know, the Gulf War was fought over that. But here's the other thing that's interesting, is that oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait only represented 9.65% of Gazprom's total assets. More than 90% was still on the balance sheet. So what that means is that the market was saying that 99.7% had been stolen, and we've just concluded that more than 90% is still there. Now, what do you do as an investor when you see that kind of economic dislocation between perception and reality? Well, I'll tell you what we did. We backed up the truck and bought as much Gazprom as we could possibly buy, and then I shared the information with the press. I shared the information with the press about all the different stealing schemes and how much was left in the company. And what happened after that was quite unique, was after we shared the information with the press, this was like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, the Russian press picked it up, and pretty soon it was picked up over and over. There were more than 500 articles written about the stealing at Gazprom. It created a controversy where there was debates in Parliament, and then the management of Gazprom hired PricewaterhouseCoopers to write a report saying all this theft was good for the company. And I hope there's no PricewaterhouseCoopers people in the audience tonight. And then eventually, and this was the most interesting thing, at the annual general meeting the next year, it had created such a controversy that Putin stepped in, and he fired the CEO of Gazprom and replaced him with a guy whose job it was not to steal assets from the company. And I stress assets. It was okay to steal other things, just not assets. But as soon as he made the announcement about not stealing assets, the share price jumped like 130%. And then it jumped another 100%, and another 100%, and another 100%. The share price of Gazprom went up 100 times. Not 100%, 100 times. Now, as you can imagine, I felt pretty good about this, right? And I did it again at the National Savings Bank and at the National Electricity Company and various other places. Now, you may ask, how is it that they allowed some guy from the south side of Chicago to do this? And the answer was that Putin had the same enemies as me. He had come to power, and the people who were stealing money from me were stealing power from him. And I've never met Putin, but we had this alignment of interests. And so every time I would publicize one of these scandals, he would step in. And nobody would touch me because in Russia, it's one big country of conspiracy theories, and people couldn't imagine I was doing this on my own volition. They thought that I must be some type of, clever Putin project. And I wasn't going to disabuse anybody of that notion because it kept me alive. And so this worked perfectly. I had the best job in the world where I could make money and do good in the same job. And for 4 years, I was living in an absolute blessed state until Putin won his war with the oligarchs when he arrested the richest oligarch in the country in late 2003, Michael Hordakovsky, the owner of Yukos Oil Company. They arrested him, put him in jail, and allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. Now, if you're the 17th richest man in Russia and you see the richest man sitting in a cage, what's your natural reaction going to be? You don't want to sit in that cage. And so one by one, the oligarchs went back to Putin and said, Vladimir Vladimirovich, what do we have to do to not sit in that cage? And I wasn't there, so I can't attest to this firsthand, but this is what I believed his response was, which was 50%. Could have been 40%, it could have been 60%. Could have been some more complicated formula. But what I do know is that after that, the oligarchs changed their behavior towards Putin, and he changed his behavior towards them. And as I carried on with all of my exposés, they were no longer against his enemies, but against his business partners. And in November 13th, 2005, as I was flying back to Russia from a business trip abroad, I was stopped at the border. I was detained for 15 hours in the airport detention center, and then I was deported from Russia and declared a threat to national security. Now, I knew then that when Russia turns on you, they don't do it mildly, they do so with extreme prejudice. And so at that point, I evacuated my staff, and we quickly and quietly sold all of our securities. And I thought, okay, my people are out. They can't seize any of our money. I dusted off my hands and said, I'm done with Russia. Unfortunately for me, Russia was just getting started with me. And on June 4th, 2007, 25 police officers raided my office in Moscow. 25 more officers raided the office of a law firm that I used, American law firm that I used to administer our investment companies. The purpose of the raids was to seize all of our corporate documents. Once the documents were seized, we discovered that we no longer owned our investment holding companies. These were companies that at this point were empty, but they didn't know that. So the police seized documents and then stole our investment holding companies. At this point, I hire a young lawyer named Sergey Magnitsky, a 36-year-old lawyer working for an American law firm, to assist me in trying to figure out what was going on. And he does an investigation, and he comes back and he says there were two objectives of this crime. The first was the officials wanted to steal your money, but they didn't succeed because you didn't have any money there. And he said the second objective, which they did succeed in, was that when we liquidated all of our holdings, we showed a profit of $1 billion, and we paid $230 million of taxes to the Russian government. And this group of police officers, crooks, and government officials applied for a $230 million tax refund 2 days before Christmas in 2007. It was the largest tax refund in Russian history, and it was approved the very next day. Now, so this is what we discovered, and I was sure that Putin is a nationalist, that he might allow people to steal from me, but how could he possibly allow his own people to steal from his own government? And as a nationalist, I thought that he'd want to know that this is what these people were doing to his country. And so we wrote criminal complaints to every law enforcement agency in Russia. We got it into the newspapers, and Sergey testified against the police officers who were involved in the raid, assuming that the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. And what we discovered was that in the Putin regime, there are no good guys. Instead of going after the bad guys, they arrested Sergey Magnitsky on November 24th, 2008. They put him in pretrial detention, and then they began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on for 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat, no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They move him from cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the objective of all this ill treatment was to try to get him to withdraw his testimony against the police officers and to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million and he did it at my instruction. Now, none of us know how we would behave in a situation like this. I don't know how I would behave. Sergey probably didn't in advance know how he would behave. But when he was faced with this choice of perjuring himself and bearing false witness versus dealing with the physical pain, for him the moral pain of signing a false confession was just something he was not willing to do, and he kept on refusing. As a result of this torture, he ended up losing 40 pounds, developing terrible pains in his stomach, and being diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. 1 week before the operation was scheduled, they came to him and asked him again if he would sign this false confession. Again, he refused. And they abruptly moved him from a prison with a hospital to a prison, a maximum security prison called Butyrka, with no medical facilities at all. And at Butyrka, his health completely broke down, and they refused him all medical treatment. He went into constant agonizing, ear-piercing pain, and he and his lawyers wrote 20 different requests for medical attention. Every one of their requests was either ignored or refused. And then finally, on the night of November 16th, 2009, his body finally gave out and he went into critical condition. On that evening, the Butyrka prison authorities then put him in an ambulance to a prison that had medical facilities. But when he arrived at the new prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell, they chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died at the age of 37. That was November 16th, 2009, a little more than 5 years ago. Sergey left a wife and 2 children. I got the news the next morning, and I can tell you it's by far the worst news I've ever gotten in my life. This was a man who was killed very specifically because he worked for me. He was killed in the most horrific and inhumane way because he was my lawyer. And for me, there was really no other choice at that moment in time but to put aside everything else in my life, all of my business, everything, and make sure that the people who killed him face justice. And for the last 5.5 years, that's what I've been doing. And I made a vow to myself, to him, and to his family that I wasn't going to let these people get away with it. And this was a particularly unusual case because many of these cases of human rights abuse in Russia, there's plausible deniability. In this particular case, Sergey wrote everything down. He wrote down 450 complaints in his 358 days in detention. He wrote all of this stuff down, who did what to him, where, why, how, and when. He wrote it down, and he filed these complaints once a month with his lawyer. All of his complaints were either ignored or rejected, but I got copies of them. And as a result of that, we have the most well-documented human rights abuse case that came out of Russia in the last 35 years. And I would have expected, no matter how corrupt Russia was, that they would have to at least prosecute some mid-level people because it was just so clear and so obvious. But Russia and Putin and his regime decided instead to circle the wagons. They exonerated every single person involved. They gave special promotions and state honors to some of the most complicit. And the only 2 people who have ever been prosecuted in this whole affair was Sergey Magnitsky himself, 3 years after he died, in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. Not even Stalin did that. And me, as his co-conspirator, and I was sentenced in absentia to 9 years in Russian prison in July of 2013. So it became clear to us that the only way that we would be able to get any justice in the Magnitsky case was to get justice outside of Russia. And we said to ourselves, how can we get justice outside of Russia? And the answer was that the people who did this crime did it for money. They did it for $230 million. And as easy as it was for them to steal that money could be stolen from them if they kept it in Russia, so they like to keep the money in the West. And so I said to myself, then we should make sure they can't travel to the West or keep their money in the West. And I took this idea to Washington. And I went and I met a senator from Maryland, a Democrat named Benjamin Cardin, who said, this is an outrageous story, we can do something about this. And then I went and met a Republican from Arizona, John McCain, who said the same thing. And so I put the 2 of them together, and they came up with something called the Sergey Magnitsky Act to impose visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergey Magnitsky. They announced it in October of 2010, and soon after they announced it, without any intervention from me, various Russian human rights activists and opposition politicians came to Washington on their own volition, and they said, "You've found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. They like to behave like cannibals at home and eat on fine white tablecloths in the West. And by doing this, you hit them exactly where it counts." One of the people who came to Washington was a man named Boris Nemtsov, whose name many of you will know, who was a member of the Russian opposition, leader of the Russian opposition, who was murdered right in front of the Kremlin on the 27th of February. So after a number of these people came forward, Senators Cardin and McCain added 65 words to the Magnitsky Act, so it didn't just include the people who killed Sergei, it included all gross human rights abusers in Russia. And it then gathered momentum very quickly. There isn't a Russian torture and murder lobby in Washington to oppose it. And in late November 2012, the House of Representatives voted 89% in favor of this law. The Senate voted 92-4, and President Obama signed it into law on December 14th, 2012. There are now 34 people on the U.S. federal OFAC sanctions list right next to Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists who are involved in the murder of Sergei Magnitsky. We're trying to do the same thing in Europe now, in Canada, in Australia. And this really upsets Putin. This is a terrible, terrible insult to Putin because this is the one place where he can't protect his officials. And I've been told by people who have been in Russian prisons that since this happened, that the treatment of prisoners has improved because everybody is afraid of getting stuck onto the Magnitsky list. And so it's certainly is not real justice. Real justice would be putting the people in jail who killed Sergey Magnitsky, but it's a small step in the right direction, and it's the end of total impunity. And I'm certainly not done with the campaign. I'm just getting started. The other part of the campaign, which has been mentioned here, is that is telling the story, and the story is told in my book, Red Notice, which a lot of people who I've met coming in here have already read. If you haven't read it, it's as my publisher describes it, it's not vegetables, it's dessert, which means it's an entertaining book to read, even though it's a heavy story. And when you read it, it will leave you with one feeling, which is a feeling you can't get away from, which is that Putin is not a regular head of state, but he's a criminal. He's a criminal who's running, he's like a mafia boss with all the powers of a sovereign state. I think I'll leave it at that because I think I've just gone over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll now go out to the audience for your questions. If you can, please raise your hand, wait for the mic, and please do make your question a question. Yes, the gentleman towards the back.
Can you ask people to introduce themselves?
Oh, yes, and if you could please introduce yourself when you ask a question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jim Lautenbach. Thank you for your comments. That was very informative. Could you just comment on what happened to Sergey's family?
Sure. So basically, I've stepped into Sergey's shoes in terms of his responsibility towards his family, and they're living in London and being taken care of by myself and my partners. And his widow lives in a safe environment, and his son goes to school in a nice English school and learning English and doing well.
Great. Next question, please. Yes, right here, please. Mike is just behind you.
I read the book, and it's fantastic, and I would encourage everybody to buy the book. You can't put it down. I'm wondering, a small thing, after you were thrown out of Russia, and after your lawyer was killed, you had to get more guards around you. When you come to the United States, do you bring some of them with you?
Well, you know, the best way to protect yourself when you have a murderous sovereign state after you is not to announce your security measures in a public forum.
All right, next question, please. Yes, the gentleman right in the middle in the front row of the second section. Yep, with the glasses.
Does any,
Sir, can you introduce yourself, please?
my name's Jerry Shane, and I read the book and I enjoyed it, and thank you. Does anybody now invest in Russia?
That's a good question. The answer is that there are always people that can ignore the obvious, and there's not that many. I go to this World Economic Forum in Davos each year, and there was an incident a couple years ago where I was sitting at a dinner with a bunch of people I hadn't met, and they organize these dinners where you can sit and meet new people. And so I was sitting, so to the right of me and to the left of me were two people, and we all wear these name tags. And so the guy on the right of me grabbed my name tag to sort of see who I was, and he said, "Oh, you're Bill Browder. You're the reason I don't invest in Russia." And then the guy on my left said, "Yeah, exactly. We don't invest in Russia either because of you." And so I think that 95% of businesses who have a choice whether they should be whether they need to be in Russia or not are not in Russia. But there are oil companies. If you're an oil company, where's the oil? There's in Angola, Venezuela, a lot of bad places in Russia. And so a lot of oil companies that just can't sort of get away from Russia. And then there are a few people who just sort of don't pay attention to the obvious. But I would say that at this point, most people who have money in Russia would love not to have their money in Russia if they can get it out.
Yes, right here in the third row. Karen Kane, please.
Hello, Karen Kane. Thank you for being here. The world has now observed a Putin that is pretty frightening, but you had seen it firsthand. How do you see it playing out on the world stage?
Yeah, well, that's the existential question. We may not survive this ultimately. So let me explain to you my theory of Putin's behavior. It comes back to those days in 2004 when Putin met with all those oligarchs and said 50%. At that moment in time, in my opinion, Putin became the richest man in the world. And in my analysis, Putin's worth $200 billion. And people around him in the aggregate have stolen $1 trillion from the country. And they've stolen this money, and for a period of time when they stole the money, the standard of living was rising when the oil price was rising. And so from about 2000 to 2008, people were getting better off. The global financial crisis hit in 2008. People got worse off, and then things stagnated in Russia after that. And as things stagnated, people started to say, I'm not so happy with all this stealing that's going on. The Russian people were saying that. And they went out into the streets in 2012 en masse. And Putin was successful in his repression of those people selectively by arresting people. But he was always worried about people coming with their pitchforks to Red Square. And then all of a sudden, his worst nightmare came true in a neighboring country of Ukraine, where there was a junior varsity version of him, this guy Viktor Yanukovych, who was just a sort of less organized crook who had less stuff to steal. And in his case, the people did come with their pitchforks to Maidan Square and overthrew him. And Putin saw that and he panicked, and he said to himself, my God, eventually they're going to come for me in Red Square unless I do something. So there's a tried and true method for distracting a population, and that's to start a war. And the taking of Crimea, which didn't require any loss of life, was his reaction to his fear of being overthrown by his own people. And it worked. His approval ratings went from 55 to 88%. And in addition to taking Crimea, they also ran propaganda 24 hours a day on Russian television, convincing the Russian people that Ukrainians were Nazi fascists that were going to ethnically cleanse the good Russian-speaking people of eastern Ukraine. So everybody was absolutely convinced that these evil Ukrainians were going to do terrible things to Russians. Putin was the man who was going to fix it. He fixed it. But Putin couldn't just walk away from this. He had to keep on going. And so he went into eastern Ukraine. By going into eastern Ukraine, he then ended up killing a lot of people and shooting down an airplane, which then led to sanctions. The sanctions have created economic hardship and a collapse of the ruble. Economic hardship and a collapse of the ruble means that he needs to ratchet up his nationalism and do more bad stuff. Where does it all end? I don't know. But I don't think it ends with Ukraine. I think that Putin would like to go into the Baltics. He'd like to test the NATO Article 5 Treaty of NATO, which requires everybody to protect one another, to see whether the United States and France and Germany are ready to go to war with Russia over Estonia, if that's what it comes to. And Putin would like to gamble that maybe they wouldn't. And so I don't know where it all goes, but here you have a man who's using every tool that he has available to him to stay in power. He's gotten all this money through mafia tactics, and he has his finger on the nuclear button and has even muttered words about being ready to use it. And so I think that we have potentially a very dangerous future ahead of us. And I think that the main policy of the United States and Europe has to be containment. It can't be appeasement. And I think that there's a big debate, and there's a lot of appeasement people in Washington and in Brussels and various other places, and I don't think that people have fully understood what they're dealing with yet, but that is what they're dealing with.
All right, next question, please. Yes, the gentleman about 3/4 towards the back with his hand up on the outside. Yep, right in front of you, Zoe. Thank you. And if you can just introduce yourself quickly.
Okay. Hello. Michael Levescu. I have a quick question. Today in Russia, the youth, particularly people over 18, are starting to become more vocal. Do they pose a threat to Putin in the future in terms of how Putin's economy will change, or will he still manage to hold on to all of his power?
the entire population is either a threat to Putin or not, depending on how he manages the situation. As people get the key constituent or the key contributor to his safety is whipping people up into a sense of nationalist frenzy. But the key risk to him is, as the economy gets worse and worse, hungry people generally blame their leader. And so I don't think there is no formula for determining how this whole thing plays itself out. I like to describe it as an equation. On one side, you have how angry are the people, and on the other side, how scared are the people. And if the fear is greater than the anger, then he'll stay in power. If the anger becomes greater than the fear, then he'll be overthrown. There is no real way of calculating that, and I think that's, he's just as scared as anyone could be, because he doesn't know when it all may come to an end.
Yes, right here in the third row, Cecilia Moat, please.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and for having the courage that you've had. I'd also like to thank you for being somebody who did sort of the unusual suspect kind of investment. Could you talk a little bit about what you think led to the conditions for privatization to have been so underestimated? I recall back in the late 80s and early 90s, attorneys coming here, and the biggest concern about what was going on with privatization was what were they going to do with the cash currency and getting money in and out, but there wasn't anything about valuation. Can you talk about that, and can you also maybe talk about other places where you're now investing? Other unusual suspects for us.
Thanks, Cecilia.
When the Russians, so they came up with this privatization program, and the basic thesis was, if we go from communism to capitalism, let's just create a bunch of capitalists. Let's give everything away for free. And so it didn't work out from almost every perspective. The first thing that didn't work out was that instead of giving everything away for free to the people, they gave everything away for free to 22 individuals. 22 individuals ended up with 39% of the country. The second thing they did wrong was it's like building a beautiful house without putting in plumbing and electricity. The plumbing and electricity in Russia was rule of law and property rights, and they never bothered to do that. And so how do you have companies and company law and agreements and so on and so forth if the courts don't work, if the laws don't work, if there's no property rights? And so part of the reason that everything was so cheap was because nobody really knew what was going to happen. Now, my calculation at the time was that things were trading at greater than a 99% discount. So the worst that could happen is it goes to 100% discount. But if it doesn't go to 100% discount, and if they don't take it away from you, then it maybe goes to a 90% discount. And I thought the chances were 50-50. So if you have a 50% chance of losing all your money, and you have a 50% chance of making 10 times your money, most people would take that bet. And that was my calculation. A lot of other people said, well, there's a 50% chance of losing my money. I don't want to put any money there. But I thought, okay, but put 1% of your money there, and if 1% turns into 10%, that's great. If 1% goes down to 0, it's not so bad. Now, everybody always asks me, where's the next Russia? And I'm afraid to say there's never going to be another situation like that. That was a historic business anomaly. Everything else requires much greater risk. There's very few things that have a 50% chance of going up 10 times in the world. And I would argue right now, I made all my money in emerging markets, but right now I've got almost no money in emerging markets. And the reason I don't is because I think that there's been a huge flow of money into emerging markets for the last 20 years. And the world has undervalued the political risk, economic risk, and property risk that exists, not to the same extent as it does in Russia, but it does exist. These risks exist in these emerging markets. And I think that emerging markets need to be a lot cheaper before they present a great buying opportunity. And so I don't think there's any great bargains in America, but America and Western Europe are the places where they have courts and laws and so on and so forth. And so maybe I'm not going to make 10 times my money, but at least it's not going to be taken away from me.
Yes, all the way in the back there, please. Oh, just wait for the mic and please do introduce yourself.
Sandy Finkel is my name. Can you please comment on the relationship between Russia and Iran and what's your take on what's going on?
That's a great question and a very timely question. Russia is a part of this group of people negotiating with Iran on nuclear, on getting rid of their nuclear weapons or weapons capabilities. And I was asked about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago what Russia was going to do as this agreement came towards fruition. And I was on a CNBC program, and they asked me, and I'm not an expert on Russian-Iranian relations, but I'm enough of an expert on Putin to say that I'm sure he's going to do something to mess it up. And why is he going to do something to mess it up? The answer is because if sanctions are lifted on Iran, then they can sell oil. If Iranian oil enters the market, and we're in a pretty thin market right now, then what happens to the price of oil? It goes down a lot. Russia's main export is oil, so it can't be in Putin's interest to allow Iran to export their oil. And so I didn't know what they were going to do to mess it up, and the guy on TV kept on probing me, asking me, what are they going to do to mess it up? And I said, I don't know. And then it became obvious what they're going to do to mess it up last week, which was all of a sudden, like 2 days after they announced that everyone has come to terms on this agreement, the Russians announced that they're going to sell the S-100 or S-300 anti-missile system to the Iranians. Well, guess what? Nobody in Congress is going to allow this deal to go through with the Russians supplying arms to the Iranians in this whole thing. And so I don't believe that the Russians are going to allow an Iran deal to actually happen because it's just too detrimental to their economic interests. He's saying, isn't Iran smart enough to see that? I'm not sure Iran, I mean, I don't know what, as I say, I'm not an expert on Iran, but apparently they're not the ones, they're not saying we don't want the S-300 now. So, I would have thought the same thing. I thought, okay, you get your deal, you can sell your oil, wouldn't you walk away from this Russian deal? But apparently they haven't.
Thanks. Next question, please. I know we have a group of students from St. Ignatius here. Would a student like to? Yes, the gentleman towards the end there with the tie on.
Thank you. My name is Cameron Woods, and my question was, what type of international precedent do you think the Magnitsky Act could set in terms of bringing world leaders outside of Russia to justice in terms of human rights violations?
Thank you.
Great question, and very relevant question, because we kind of stumbled onto this as the new technology, as the sort of iPad of human rights advocacy, and the senators who backed the Russian Magnitsky Act at the end of January this year have introduced the Global Magnitsky Act, which would do the same to Chinese, Saudi, Uzbek human rights violators as the Magnitsky Act does to Russian human rights violators. And from a sort of moral standpoint, there's no reason why an Uzbek human rights violator should get a better deal than a Russian human rights violator. So this is the piece of legislation that's going through Congress right now. I'm actually going to Washington next week to testify in front of Congress to push this forward. It's not going to be an easy sell because there's a lot of people who don't want to sanction the good, let me put this in quotation, the good human rights violators, only the bad ones. But I think we will ultimately prevail.
All right, yes, right down here. Chris Keogh, please.
Hi, Chris O'Day. Thanks for coming.
Excuse me.
If you, just listening to the thread of your story, was there at any point, did you think perhaps that it was not going to work out well with being sort of aligned with Putin's interests? And did you have a contingency plan of any type for that, thinking maybe, if you had enough 10-baggers, that was enough and kind of move on?
Human psychology is very interesting. Very rarely does anyone ever get off the gravy train when you're on it. I never thought that Russia would default and devalue in 1998. I never thought that that Putin's interests were. I was looking at Putin as I wanted to see him, not as how he was. And a lot of people do that. He's got this completely, it's almost paralyzed face, so you can't even tell what he's thinking. He doesn't have any facial expression, and so you can project whatever you're thinking. Whatever you think he's thinking. And so I thought he was a good guy that was just trying to make Russia a more normal country, and I never thought that this was some kind of like short-term deal. And so I wrote it as I was writing it. And the other thing is, you kind of, to do what I did, to go to Russia in the first place, to take on the oligarchs, to do all this stuff, you kind of have to have, your risk antennas have to be sanded off a little bit to do that. And so I wasn't busy looking for like I wasn't looking for the potholes in the road ahead. I was just kind of blundering on, hoping for the best and seeing what was going to happen. And obviously that wasn't the right way to proceed, but that is what I did.
All right, next question, please. Yes, the young woman right in the middle back there. Thank you. Just to your left, with the striped shirt on, right there. If you could just introduce yourself. Thank you.
My name is Veronica Lusk. Would you say that the power of the oligarchs is more or less than when they first gained control of Russian industries, and where do you think it's going to go from there?
So it used to be that the oligarchs were all powerful. They would buy up members of the law enforcement agencies to arrest their enemies. They would buy up members of the secret police to gather information on their competitors. They'd gather up members. They would bribe members or generals in the army to like build roads for them with troops, and the entire state was bastardized by the oligarchs. And then Putin came in, and came up with a very simple formula for making them all beholden to him, which is to arrest one of them and show the rest of them that any of them could be arrested and there's no amount of money that can buy them out of jail. And basically anybody who has the power to arrest other people and can hold on to that power universally is all powerful. And so there's this misconception right now that the oligarchs might one day rise up and take over Russia from Putin because it's so bad for business. And that's a very untrue projection of what's going to happen. Every oligarch that I've ever met is cowering right now. They may be worth billions of dollars, but these are scared little men because they know that at any moment in time they could be arrested, impoverished, or killed for one bad thought about Putin. And so they have no power at all other than the power that's granted to them temporarily by Putin as long as they're in his good graces.
All right, next question, please. Yes, the gentleman about 3 in. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Damian Richardson. Thank you for sharing your story. My question is, so you talked about trying to get justice for Magnitsky outside of Russia because it was impossible to get justice inside of Russia. Can you talk about any efforts to get justice in international organizations like the International Court of Justice instead of getting justice by taking these men's money?
Well, there are several other initiatives going on. One is that Sergey's widow and his mother have taken Russia as a country to the European Court of Human Rights. And that case will be adjudicated this year, where hopefully the result will be a conviction of the Russian state. Now, it's not a particularly satisfying conviction because it doesn't convict people, it convicts the state. And there's a small financial award and a bunch of blistering sentences, but it doesn't, when I say sentences, there are sentences on a piece of paper, not jail sentences. The other initiative which we have taken on is we've said to ourselves, until we can get the people for torture and murder in Russia, we might as well at least get them for money laundering and theft outside of Russia. And so a team of people who work for me have been tracking the money for the last 5 years and have identified quite a bit of the $230 million. And we've cooperated with law enforcement agencies all over the world. And for example, the US Department of Justice about a year ago seized $20 million of apartments in Lower Manhattan that were purchased using proceeds from the Magnitsky crime. The Swiss police have seized $20 million at UBS and Credit Suisse belonging to the perpetrators, and there's about a dozen other criminal investigations going on around the world.
Next question, please. Yes, all the way in the back. Tarana, just behind you. Thanks. And if you can introduce yourself, sir.
Levi Smith from Detroit. My great-grandfather left Russia 1890. Thank God. Where do you put Putin in the spectrum of the czars and Stalin? Is he somewhere between Ivan the Terrible and Stalin?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, so far Putin hasn't done mass executions, which is to his favor. But we're not done with Putin yet, and we don't know what he's going to do in the future. The thing which I find so distasteful about Putin is that he has no ideology at all. Everybody else had an ideology. Putin's ideology is just money, stealing money. And because of that, it makes it, in a certain way, makes it easier and makes it harder. But Stalin, as much of a monster as he was, he at least did it for some type of ideological reasons, and so there was some way of dealing with him on an ideological basis. But Putin is just it's like Pablo Escobar with nukes, and so we don't know. We don't know how Putin is going to end up. We don't know if he's ultimately going to use a tactical nuclear weapon and kill millions of people. We don't know if he's going to start mass purges. And so until we're done with Putin, I don't want to compare him to any of these people. But what I can say is that he scares me as much as Stalin or Hitler. And left to his own devices, he may do similarly atrocious things.
Yes, right down front. Kate Torshin, please.
The leaders, the oligarchs and Putin, seem to have taken some of their financial assets out of the country. Have you traced that, and is there a way to control what's happening, at least to some extent, by controlling the assets that are outside the country?
Well, this is their Achilles heel, which is all of their money is outside the country. And it's very easy. Putin's money is not held in his own name, it's held in the name of oligarch trustees. And I believe that a simple way to get at Putin would be to seize the assets of the top 100 oligarchs in the West. And I think Putin would quickly come to the negotiating table after that. Since all he cares about is money, if you take his money, that hits him right where it counts.
Yes, the gentleman right on the end, just behind you, Tarana. Thanks, with the blue shirt.
I'm digressing a little bit, but I wonder if you could touch on a little bit about your life in Russia. I think of myself as growing up in Chicago. You said you're a boy from the south side of Chicago. You end up in Russia. And just touch a little bit more about what life is like outside of your business while living in Russia.
And a quick introduction, please.
Barry Misner.
Thank you.
It was kind of a crazy life there. I mean, Moscow was highly underdeveloped when I first got there. I mean, to find an apartment that had like sort of proper showers and running water was a big ordeal. And you could, if you lived like the way the Russians lived, you would live very, very cheaply. But if you wanted to live even a sort of half normal Western life, it would cost you 4 times the amount it would cost you in Chicago to live. I couldn't drive myself in Moscow because every time I would drive my car, I'd be pulled over by a traffic policeman. And so I ended up having to hire a former traffic policeman to drive me, because then whenever he got pulled over, he just flashed his badge and everybody saluted him. It was the kind of place where any vacation time you ever had, you wanted to get out of the country. It wasn't a comfortable place to stay. But at the same time, it was also a place that was fascinating and interesting. I can tell you that Russian people, I hope that I haven't given the impression that Russians are bad, because that's not what I'd like to say here tonight. I believe there's 141 million Russians that are good, decent, honest, hardworking people, and there's about 1 million really bad ones who have occupied the country. And when you have a Russian friend, a real Russian friend will go to the ends of the earth for you in ways that a Western friend won't. That's a real friendship. The people who work for me, I have people that have been working for me for close to 20 years, for like 17 years. The best, most loyal, most honest colleagues I've ever had were Russians. And so, it's a place of intense sort of contradictions where everybody loves it and hates it. And anybody who's ever spent any time there can never forget about it, and everybody sort of continues to talk about it among themselves even years afterwards. And so, I hope one day that when the Putin regime ends and the new regime is there, that I can go back, because it's a country that I hated and I loved, and will always hate and love in equal proportions.
We have time for one last question. Yes, the gentleman just 3 seats in from the end there.
Hi, I'm Tom Porter. I wanted to ask you a question about Putin's wealth. You estimate that at $200 billion, which would make him the richest person in the world. Can you do a deeper analysis of how you kind of got to that number?
Well, there's a real simple back of the envelope, which is that if you believe my theory that the oligarchs, that there's a 50-50 deal between Putin and the oligarchs on their wealth, and then you do a calculation of the wealth of the top 100 oligarchs, it's 400 billion. And you just multiply that by 0.5, and that gets you to 200 billion.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this evening. Thank you to Bill Browder, and he'll be signing copies of his book just outside the room. Thank you all for coming, and good night. Thank you so much. Can I show you back? Yeah.